I want to talk today a little bit about the process of becoming an international church and sort of when that happened and the role that buildings played in that process. It's sort of one of those things that we're now looking at more in terms of the gathering and when the gathering took place, the doctrine of the gathering to come to Utah or the Intermountain West. And there's a lot of discussion now about Joseph F. Smith, Heber J. Grant, things that they said in terms of staying where you were. And there certainly was a change at that point. There almost is a leap of faith that says that because of that, we then became an international church. I guess that depends on your definition of an international church, because we did have an international missionary system and we had members in many parts of the world. But it's going to be my thesis that we in fact became an international church between the end of World War II and 1965 or 1970, and that buildings played a very important role in that process. Oh dear, what have I got? What do I need? Okay. There we go, okay. Well, that was good. There we go. I'd like to start out with T. Browning Woodbury, who was one of the most colorful mission presidents that we've had. He was mission president in England, and as part of that, in the Millennial Star, he talked about his goals that he had formulated in 1958. And this article was talking about the progress that had been made. Oh boy, those goals were, and he had three goals: the elimination of immigration. He said allowing for free enterprise, to allow for personal ability to decide on that. Local leadership in branches and districts, constructive and well-defined building program, but he didn't include the missionary program and missionary work, which is the one he's best known for. The importance of buildings and understanding that importance is not new. When the university branch in Chicago was dedicated, within a year, the attendance at the Sunday school had doubled because of the building. German Ellsworth, who was president of 2 missions and was mission president for 25 years, said, "I told the presiding brethren, if it were left to me, I would first build chapels in prosperous, growing cities, and then send in a group of missionaries to build the branch instead of trying to build branches in old, rented, tobacco-stained lodge halls." This is the university branch that we built in Chicago, and the building which helped to double those attendance. B.F. Larson, when he was studying art in Paris, was told that no self-respecting Frenchman would join the church because they were used to worshiping in cathedrals. We worshiped in rented halls, and the pianos were often out of tune. World War II to 1965 or 1970 had a number of things that happened, and we'll talk about each of these in greater detail. The 3 international temples that took place, the building missionary program, the precedents for later programs, the question of how do you formulate a building program. Do you do a corporate or a country model for building international buildings? Some of those buildings, we'll look at a fair number of those buildings, including several from Sir Thomas Bennett, who was the one who built the Hyde Park Chapel, and a number of other buildings, and a series of other buildings that were there. And it's my contention that these were basic to the international growth and development of the church. In the period before the Second World War, many of the best buildings that we had in the church were either mission buildings or extension of the boundaries of Zion. These are some of the mission buildings that were there, and you can see they were really wonderful buildings in many parts, particularly in Europe, but also in South America and South Africa. Buildings that were there to house the missionaries, the mission presidency, and to direct the work that went forth from those. The 2 best international buildings during that time were the 2 temples in Cardston and in Hawaii. But in many ways, those buildings were really an extension of Zion. both in Juarez, Mexico, in Cardston. Those were Mormon colonies. Joseph F. Smith had said that the Isles of the Sea didn't need to be gathered, that they were already part of Zion. So you really have this extension of what Zion is. Other international buildings before World War II, there are a couple of places to find out about those, although they don't have nearly all the buildings. Mormon Architecture, a book that was published, and on the back of the Improvement Era, for 4 years they had buildings on the back of those that talked about buildings in the United States as well as international buildings. And these are some of the buildings that were there. Argentina, Australia. This one in Hull, England, was one, in fact, that a missionary designed and then was built by the local community. It's now the Islamic Center of Hull, England. This building in Toronto, which we still own and use, as well as this one in Mexico City, which is, I think, a wonderful early building that was there, and this one in French Polynesia, which again is a magnificent building that we had, all of those before the Second World War. The Second World War did a number of things which had impact on buildings and on the internationalization of the church. It destroyed most European meeting houses, particularly on the continent, not as much in Scandinavia, created a climate of searching within many countries and many people. LDS servicemen and women helped introduce the gospel in many areas. There was a shortage of building materials, and in some areas they bought buildings and turned them into chapels. Strengthened the local leadership, particularly in Europe, where you had no ability to have any leadership from Zion come in. And finally, the obvious one with the need for food, clothing, and shelter that it presented in Europe. When President Benson took his 1946 relief mission, he took care of those immediate needs, but he also did a lot more than that. He also examined many, many building sites. He also trained and set apart many leaders that helped change in terms of those other items that we were talking about, that needs for the international church. Without doubt, the most important buildings in the international church were the 3 temples that were done in Switzerland, in New Zealand, and in London. It's difficult to overemphasize their importance. It really was the first outside of these extended boundaries, the first temples that were there. It symbolized for members that were living in Europe and elsewhere that they could live there and continue to live there and have the blessings of the temple, the highest blessings that we can have. It offered hope to many other people throughout the world. And there was also a terribly important thing for Western United States members of the church, that we are now a national institution. That it's not just the temples or not just in other places, but we really are a national institution. The building program at different points during this time was overseen in 2 different ways. The first was through the presiding bishopric, and LeGrand Richards was the presiding bishop during much of this time. And the second, there was a new church building committee that was set up with Mendenhall as the chairman of that, and it was done directly under the first presidency. Here's a photograph of them working. One of the things that all through this whole period you were looking at was, how do you site and what kinds of buildings do you build? And there was a real desire to have buildings that were a credit to the country and to the church, to have both of those. Many were, in fact, the symbols of the church in that land or in that country. LeGrand Richards has a wonderful story where he went to Mexico. They had selected a building they wanted him to buy. He went down. Before he got to the building, he said, no, we're not going to do it. And they said, well, you haven't even seen it. And he said, yeah, but I've seen the neighborhood. And so he helped them find another one, and he said that the neighborhood was important. They wanted to find a middle-class neighborhood, and that the poor would come up and the humble rich would come down to the neighborhood, but that was where the building should be located. The building missionary program became, particularly during the second part of this, the major area that these buildings were built. We hear a lot, and we've heard a lot about the building missionary program in the South Pacific, but it also, most of the buildings that were built in Europe were built in the same way during this time. And it was being expanded into North and South America, to the Far East. It ended in 1994, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Wendell Mendenhall, when he reported on the South Pacific gains, he talked about that the building missionaries had built over 150 chapels, 4 high schools, 3 primary schools, and a temple, as he was selling it to the Europeans. One of the questions that you had was, what kinds of buildings are you going to build? Are you basically going to do a corporate or a country model? A corporate model would be the same as McDonald's or someone else, where every building was recognized no matter where it was built. You had one symbol that could be done. A country model would allow for a great deal more flexibility in that. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those. For the corporate model, the building becomes the branding as well as the signage. It allows instant recognition, provides a sense of equality throughout the church, provides necessary facilities for all programs, and gives a sense of familiarity to all areas. On the other side, the country or regional approach provides for climatic conditions. It allows the use of local building materials and designs, helps provide for local needs. Basketball may not be the major need that you have in some of these areas. It helps foster country and regional identity, and helps avoid the stereotype that we are in fact a United States church, and allows us to be more fully seen as an international church. It also helps targeting of the church in some ways. The church solution is a combination of those two. It's an ongoing discussion. We have covered walkways, and we have a number of areas, basketball courts out in the parking lots rather than in the cultural halls, pod construction, a number of areas like you can see here. And in Africa, I understand they're still working on what does it mean and what are the appropriate buildings for Africa at this point in time. As we came to our current practices, there are a couple of areas in terms of this combination. An early experience, New Zealand Maori carved house, see in a minute. Marky Peterson, when he was appointed president of the Western European Mission, he'd been trained as a carpenter. He looked and he made a recommendation which was taken, that we use local materials rather than importing them from Utah, and local designs that were part of that. Okay, this is an LDS church building that was constructed by the church, by members of the church in New Zealand. A Maori carved house. Each of the symbolism of all the carvings has great symbolism. Here's an article about it in the instructor. In the inside, you can see, it's hard to tell on this one, the center figure is a man with a paddle, and there are 2 canoes on each side of that, meant to represent Hagar and the 4 canoe trips that came from the Book of Mormon times to New Zealand. Again, some other photographs of it. In Tahiti, here is the cultural hall. No windows, no walls. You allow the sea breezes to provide the air conditioning. Even today, there are some buildings that we have which provide that same kind of sea breeze and allow local conditions to be used. As we moved from Salt Lake designs to local designs, there's some interesting things that happened. The building on the lower left is how this chapel in Norway was conceived and what it went out in the designs. And in the upper buildings is how it was actually built after it became Norwegianized, if there's such a word. The International Church, the Hyde Park Chapel, is the best known of LDS chapels, and again, Sir Thomas Bennett. He came to Salt Lake, spoke in General Conference, one of the few non-members that did. He also designed a series of at least 3 and perhaps 4 buildings throughout England, Manchester, exterior, interior, Crowley, and in Wales near President Mackay's birthplace, and may have done the Cardiff, Wales one as well. The Berlin building was built with salvaged brick from war debris by the mission president, who had the mission home in the upper stories at the beginning. There are many of these buildings which have stories. We'll just look at a lot of these buildings very quickly. A series of them in Denmark, which do have a series of country identity as you see them as they go through. And even some of the later ones still have very much a Danish feeling as you look at the inside of them. Again, a series of wonderful international style buildings from in Europe and elsewhere. This one in Finland, the interior. This one I have to talk a little bit about. This one was built with building missionaries that the local branch had to house and feed. The branch president took 2 extra jobs and his family took a paper route to be able to feed them. This building was built when the branch had 38 members. And many of these buildings have similar kinds of stories, but pretty substantial building for that. And Netherlands, Norla. I've got to hurry on. I hope you don't get too dizzy. Brazil. This one I love. It's a little later, but it's one of my favorites. It's unusual for a Mormon building. Well, these buildings were not only done, but were very quickly talked about in the church. The church put out a program on the building program, which had color photographs or renderings of lots of buildings around, including this one with a map showing the world and where our buildings were there. The era produced one on Mormon buildings, most of them in the United States, but a large one on the building missionaries in the South Pacific, and this one in Australia, which is labeled the Silent Missionary, again telling us what we're trying to do. 2 buildings on the story of the church, one in the United States and one in England, with temples of the world and a worldwide church on the other side. The centerfold for both were these large 4 fold-out pages with all the buildings that were there. The Mormon Story, a series of other books that people did. The first one in 57 had chapels, but they were all in the United States. In 63, they added all of these that were in other countries that were there. A look at Mormonism, again added in 62, a whole series of other international buildings. Meet the Mormons had a page from the earliest time on LDS buildings around the church. Well, these buildings were done particularly under Mendenhall and the first presidency, including President Moyle. There was a time when we, because of a number of things, were spending more, in fact, than we had coming in, partially because of these buildings. And so the program was shut down for 2 years. But these buildings represent, there were over 500 buildings, international buildings, that were built during that 10-year period. The buildings provided space for branches and districts that became wards and stakes. With temples and local buildings and leadership, there was no need to immigrate. Buildings did precede growth. Those first 3 temples, there were no stakes organized within the areas where those temples were built. In 1960, there was 1 stake outside this general area. Between 1960 and 1970, there were 50 stakes that were organized, and you can see the countries where they were done. I think we need to understand these buildings. We need to understand the stories. As we're now a global church, we need to understand that they are part of the record that should be kept, and we need to preserve and protect them. And perhaps the greatest testimony of these buildings is President Uchtdorf's first conference address, when he talked about his testimony coming as he was sitting in his building looking at the stained glass windows of the prophet Joseph Smith. And suddenly this was a great part of his testimony. And this is what these buildings are for, is to increase and to testify of the testimony and the work and the pioneering effort that these men and women did across the United States so that we could become an international church. Thank you.